The wooden crate creaked under the weight of Sister Mary Catherine's meager possessions as she stood at the iron gates of St. Agatha's Convent for the final time. Behind her, 8 small faces pressed against the orphanage windows, their tears streaming down glass that would soon separate them forever. Mother Superior Agnes stood rigid in the doorway, her voice cutting through the Montana morning air like a blade through fabric. "You've made your choice, Catherine Walsh," the elderly woman declared, using her former secular name with deliberate cruelty. "These children will be distributed to proper institutions where they can receive adequate care. Your attachment to them has clouded your judgment beyond redemption." But as Catherine turned to look at those 8 precious faces one final time, she saw something in their eyes that Mother Superior could never understand. It wasn't just fear or sadness, it was hope. Hope that somehow, someway, the only person who had ever truly loved them would find a way to keep them together. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The crisis that would change everything had begun 3 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday morning that started like any other in the St. Agatha's Convent and Orphanage. Sister Mary Catherine was in the kitchen before dawn, as always, preparing breakfast for the 43 children under their care. At 28, she had spent the last 10 years of her life within these walls, having taken her vows at 18 after her parents died in a railroad accident that left her with nowhere else to go. The convent sat on the outskirts of Millfield, Montana, a small town that survived primarily on cattle ranching and the occasional mining operation. The orphanage served children from across 3 counties, taking in those who had lost parents to disease, accidents, or the harsh realities of frontier life. Most children stayed only temporarily before being placed with families or sent to larger institutions in bigger cities. But 8 children had become permanent residents, the ones deemed difficult to place by social services. Catherine knew each of these 8, as if they were her own flesh and blood. There was Tommy Henderson, age 12, whose fierce protective nature had earned him a reputation for fighting anyone who threatened the younger children. Emma and Ethan Sullivan, 10-year-old twins whose parents had died in a mining accident, and who refused to be separated despite multiple attempts by placement agencies. Little Sarah Martinez, only 6, who had been mute since witnessing her family's death in a house fire. 9-year-old Jacob Brown, whose mixed heritage made him unwelcome in most potential homes. Rebecca Thompson, 11, whose clubfoot had convinced potential family she would be too much trouble. David Chun, 8, the son of Chinese immigrants whose parents had died of influenza. And finally, Lucy O'Connor, 7, whose epileptic seizures had returned her to the orphanage 3 times after failed placements. These weren't just statistics in a ledger to Catherine, they were her heart walking around outside her body. She had been the one to hold Sarah through countless nightmares, to teach Jacob to read despite his struggles with the English language, to patiently work with Lucy during her seizures, ensuring she never felt ashamed or different. Mother Superior Agnes had always disapproved of Catherine's excessive attachment to the children. The older woman, who had run St. Agatha's for nearly 30 years, believed in strict discipline, emotional distance, and the kind of rigid religious instruction that left little room for individual attention or affection. A nun's love should be for God alone. Mother Superior would remind Catherine whenever she caught her spending extra time with the difficult cases. These children need structure and preparation for their stations in life, not coddling that gives them unrealistic expectations. But Catherine couldn't help herself. When she looked at these children, she didn't see problems to be managed or burdens to be endured. She saw Tommy's brilliant mind behind his defensive anger, Emma's gift for music that emerged when she thought no one was listening, Ethan's mechanical aptitude that could fix anything with moving parts. She saw Sarah's artistic talent expressed through drawings that spoke louder than words, Jacob's natural leadership abilities that emerged when he helped younger children. Rebecca's fierce intelligence that devoured every book she could find. She saw David's mathematical genius that astounded visiting inspectors, and Lucy's compassionate heart that comforted other children during their darkest moments. The morning that changed everything began when Catherine discovered Tommy in the kitchen before her usual arrival time. The 12-year-old was attempting to cook breakfast for the younger children. His face streaked with tears he was trying desperately to hide. "Tommy, what's wrong?" Catherine asked gently, setting down her supplies and approaching him with the careful movements of someone who understood that wounded children could lash out when cornered. "They're coming today," Tommy said, his voice cracking with the effort of maintaining control. "The people from the state. Mother Superior told us last night after you went to your room. They're taking us away, all of us, to different places." Catherine felt the world shift beneath her feet. "What do you mean, taking you away?" Tommy's composure finally cracked completely. "She said the orphanage is closing the residential program. Too expensive to maintain for just 8 kids. They're sending Emma and Ethan to the state institution in Helena. Rebecca's going to someplace for crippled children in Billings. Sarah's going to an asylum because they think she's not right in the head because she won't talk. And the rest of us ... He couldn't finish the sentence. Catherine knelt down to Tommy's level, her hands shaking as she reached for his shoulders. When are they coming?" "This afternoon. We're supposed to pack our things this morning." Tommy's eyes met hers with a desperation that cut straight through her soul. "Sister Catherine, what's going to happen to us? What's going to happen to Sarah and Lucy and little David? They need someone who understands them. They need their family." Catherine finished quietly, the words emerging from some deep place within her that she hadn't known existed. For the first time in her 10 years as a nun, Catherine understood with perfect clarity that her vows to God would mean nothing if she abandoned these children to a system that saw them as problems rather than precious souls deserving of love and protection. She found Mother Superior in her office, reviewing the paperwork that would scatter her 8 beloved children across the state like seeds in a harsh wind. "Mother Superior, I need to speak with you about the children." The older woman didn't look up from her documents. "The matter is settled, Sister Mary Catherine. The state has made arrangements that serve everyone's best interests. These children require specialized care that we simply cannot provide. These children require love," Catherine said, her voice steady despite the revolutionary nature of what she was about to propose. "And I can provide that. Let me take them. Let me care for them." Mother Superior's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing with displeasure. "That is impossible. You are a nun, bound by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. You cannot simply decide to become a mother to 8 orphan children." "Then I'll leave," Catherine said simply. "I'll renounce my vows and take them as my own." The silence that followed was deafening. Mother Superior rose slowly from her chair, her face flushing with anger and disbelief. "You would abandon your sacred calling, your duty to God, for these ... these damaged children." "I would fulfill my sacred calling," Catherine replied firmly. "Christ said to suffer the little children to come unto him. He said that whoever welcomed a child in his name welcomed him. These children are not damaged. They are precious souls who deserve someone who sees their worth." Mother Superior's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "If you walk through those gates, Catherine Walsh, you will have nothing. No money, no home, no means of support. The church will not help you. The state will not approve your guardianship of 8 special needs children. You will fail, and they will end up in institutions anyway, but their suffering will be prolonged by your foolish sentiment." Catherine thought of Sarah's nightmares, of Lucy's seizures, of Tommy's fierce protectiveness, of all the small moments of joy and growth she had witnessed in these children who had been written off by everyone else. "Maybe I will fail," she admitted, "but I have to try. They deserve someone who will try." The confrontation that followed was brutal. Mother Superior called Catherine's decision a betrayal of everything sacred, accused her of corrupting her holy vows with worldly attachment, and warned her that she would find herself destitute within a month, begging to return to the convent. But even as the older woman's words lashed at her, Catherine felt a peace she had never experienced in 10 years of religious life. For the first time, she was acting not out of duty or obligation, but out of pure love for children who needed her more than anyone had ever needed anything. The legal process of renouncing her religious vows and gaining temporary custody of the 8 children took exactly 17 days. 17 days during which Catherine slept in the orphanage's guest room while Mother Superior made her life as difficult as possible, constantly reminding her of the impossibility of her chosen path. But during those same 17 days, something miraculous happened among the 8 children. The news that Sister Catherine was leaving the convent to care for them had transformed their despair into fierce determination. Tommy appointed himself the family's protector and organizer. Emma and Ethan began planning how they could contribute to their new household. Rebecca researched legal requirements for private guardianship. Even little Sarah began communicating through gestures and drawings that showed their makeshift family. In various scenarios of domestic happiness, Catherine used her own small inheritance, money left by her parents that she had never touched during her years in the convent, to secure temporary lodging in Millfield's only boarding house. Mrs. Eleanor Fletcher, the proprietor, was a widow in her 60s who had raised 4 children of her own and understood the challenges Catherine was about to face. "You're either the bravest woman I've ever met, or the most foolish," Mrs. Fletcher said as Catherine signed the rental agreement for the boarding house's largest room, taking on 8 orphan children with no husband, no steady income, and no experience of the world outside convent walls. "Probably both," Catherine admitted, watching through the window as Tommy helped the younger children organize their few possessions. "But they need someone who believes in them. And I do believe in them." Mrs. Fletcher studied the woman who had traded holy vows for an uncertain future. "Well, you'll have your hands full, that's certain. But if anyone can make this work, it might just be someone stubborn enough to take on the entire Catholic Church for a bunch of kids nobody else wants." The morning Catherine officially left St. Agatha's convent marked the end of one life and the beginning of something entirely unknown. As she gathered her 8 children around her in Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house parlor, she realized she had no clear plan beyond love and determination. Tommy raised his hand with a serious formality that had made him a natural leader among the orphaned children. "Sister ... I mean, Miss Catherine, what happens now?" Catherine looked at their expectant faces, Sarah with her wide, trusting eyes, Lucy clutching the small wooden cross Catherine had carved for her, David with his careful, intelligent expression, Rebecca with her notebook where she recorded everything important, Jacob with his protective stance near the younger children, Emma and Ethan standing together as they always did, united against the world's attempts to separate them. "Now we become a family," she said simply, "a real family. And we find a way to build a home where each of you can grow into exactly who God meant you to be." She had no money beyond her small inheritance, no home beyond their single rented room, no plan beyond faith and love. But as she looked at these 8 precious souls who had been discarded by everyone else, Catherine Walsh knew she had made the only choice her heart would allow. The real challenges were just beginning. Preparing and narrating this story took U.S. a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The single room at Fletcher's boarding house felt impossibly small with 9 people trying to live in a space meant for 2. Catherine lay awake that first night, listening to the symphony of 8 children breathing Tommy's steady rhythm from the corner where he'd insisted on sleeping to guard the door. The twins Emma and Ethan curled together like puppies on a shared mattress. Little Sarah's occasional whimpers from nightmares that still haunted her sleep. As dawn broke over Millfield, Montana, Catherine found herself remembering another morning, 18 years earlier, when she had awakened in a similar state of uncertainty. She had been 10 years old then, the only child of Michael and Rose Walsh, railroad workers who had built their entire life around the expanding Montana territories. Promise of prosperity and stability. The Walsh family had been different from most in their small railroad town of Clearwater. Michael Walsh was an educated man, a former seminary student who had left religious life to marry Rose, a schoolteacher whose Irish immigrant parents had instilled in her a fierce belief in the power of education and compassion. Together, they had created a home where intellectual curiosity was encouraged, where books lined every available wall space, and where young Catherine learned that love meant seeing the best in people, even when others couldn't. Every person carries a spark of the divine, her father used to say while they worked together in their small garden behind the railroad company housing. Some folks just need help finding the tinder to light it properly. Rose Walsh had been the one to nurture Catherine's natural instinct for caring for others. Their home had always been a refuge for railroad workers' children who needed extra help with lessons, for elderly neighbors who required assistance with daily tasks, for anyone in their small community who fell through the cracks of official care systems. Kindness is not weakness, Catherine, her mother would remind her when other children teased her for befriending outcasts. It's the strongest force in the world because it creates more of itself wherever it goes. Those lessons had shaped everything about Catherine's approach to life, including her decision at 18 to enter St. Agatha's Convent after her parents' tragic death in a railroad accident. The accident itself had been preventable, a bridge collapse caused by the railroad company's cost-cutting measures and negligent maintenance. Michael and Rose Walsh had died alongside 17 other workers when their maintenance train plunged into the Clearwater River on a winter morning that shattered their daughter's world completely. Catherine had entered the convent not out of mystical calling, but out of practical necessity combined with genuine faith. The church offered her food, shelter, education, and purpose at a time when she had nothing else. More importantly, it offered her the opportunity to care for children who, like herself, had lost everything. But the 10 years between entering religious life and this moment in Fletcher's boarding house had taught Catherine that institutional charity, however well-intentioned, could never replace the kind of individual love and attention that her parents had given her. The convent's approach to childcare was efficient, organized, and utterly lacking in the personal connection that allowed children to thrive rather than merely survive. She had learned this lesson gradually through countless small interactions with the orphaned children who passed through St. Agatha's doors. Most stayed only briefly before being placed with families or transferred to larger institutions. But the 8 who remained had taught Catherine something profound about the difference between caring for children and truly loving them. Tommy Henderson had arrived at St. Agatha's 5 years earlier, at age 7, after his father died in a mining accident and his mother succumbed to tuberculosis within 6 months. The boy's fierce anger and protective instincts had immediately marked him as difficult in Mother Superior's assessment, but Catherine had recognized something different in his behavior. During Tommy's second week at the orphanage, Catherine had discovered him in the root cellar, systematically organizing food supplies with the methodical precision of someone who had experienced real hunger. When she asked him about it, Tommy had explained with heartbreaking matter-of-factness that he was making sure there would be enough for the little kids if something happened. That conversation had revealed the depth of responsibility Tommy had carried for his dying mother during her final months, cooking meals, managing their meager finances, and caring for her with the competence of an adult twice his age. His behavioral problems weren't defiance. They were the natural response of a child who had learned that survival depended on his ability to protect those weaker than himself. Catherine had begun working privately with Tommy, channeling his protective instincts into positive leadership among the other children, while ensuring he understood that he was allowed to be a child himself sometimes. The transformation had been remarkable. Tommy's academic performance improved dramatically when he wasn't spending all his energy on defensive behaviors, revealing a sharp intelligence and natural organizational ability that impressed even Mother Superior. The Sullivan twins, Emma and Ethan, had arrived 2 years later under circumstances that highlighted everything wrong with the institutional approach to childcare. Their parents had died in a mining accident that left the 10-year-old twins as each other's only family. Social services had attempted multiple times to place them separately, arguing that twin placements were unrealistic and that the children needed to develop individual identities. Each separation had been traumatic for both children, resulting in Emma's complete withdrawal into herself and Ethan's aggressive acting out that made potential families withdraw their interest. Catherine had fought successfully to keep the twins together at St. Agatha's, arguing that their bond was a source of strength rather than unhealthy dependence. Over time, Catherine had discovered that Emma and Ethan were not just inseparable, they were genuinely complementary. Emma's musical talents emerged when she felt secure in Ethan's presence, while Ethan's mechanical aptitude flourished when he wasn't worried about Emma's well-being. Together, they formed a complete unit that was stronger than the sum of its parts. Little Sarah Martinez had been the most heartbreaking case. She had arrived at age 4, the sole survivor of a house fire that killed her parents and 3 siblings. The trauma had left her completely mute, unable or unwilling to speak despite having no physical injuries to her vocal cords. Multiple specialists had examined Sarah, offering various diagnoses and treatment recommendations that ranged from institutionalization for selective mutism to aggressive therapeutic interventions designed to force her to speak. Mother Superior had grown increasingly frustrated with Sarah's silence, viewing it as willful disobedience that required correction. But Catherine had approached Sarah differently, accepting her silence as a valid response to unbearable loss and finding alternative ways to communicate. She had provided Sarah with drawing materials, discovering that the child could express complex thoughts and emotions through artwork that revealed both her trauma and her resilience. Through patient observation, Catherine had learned that Sarah's muteness was not inability but choice. The child spoke volumes through her expressive eyes, her gentle touches, and her uncanny ability to comfort other children without words. Sarah had become the emotional heart of their small group, offering silent compassion that often proved more healing than any amount of talking. Jacob Brown's situation had illustrated the cruel realities of racial prejudice in 1890s Montana. His father had been a Buffalo Soldier, one of the African American cavalry regiments serving in the Western Territories, and his mother had been a local woman whose family disowned her for the relationship. When both parents died of influenza during Jacob's 6th year, no family members would claim him, and potential adoptive families consistently rejected him based solely on his mixed heritage. Catherine had watched Jacob struggle with questions about identity and belonging that no 9-year-old should have to face. The boy was extraordinarily intelligent and naturally charismatic, but the constant rejection had begun to erode his self-confidence. Catherine had made it her mission to ensure Jacob understood that his worth was not determined by others' prejudices, working with him on academic subjects while sharing stories of successful people who had overcome similar challenges. Rebecca Thompson's clubfoot had made her an unwanted child in a society that valued physical perfection above all else. Potential adoptive families consistently rejected her based on assumptions about her future limitations, despite her obvious intelligence and determination. Catherine had watched 11-year-old Rebecca become increasingly bitter about the unfairness of her situation, developing a sharp tongue and defensive attitude that further reduced her chances of placement. Catherine had seen beyond Rebecca's physical limitation to recognize a brilliant mind and fierce spirit that reminded her of her own mother's determination. She had worked with Rebecca on academic subjects that challenged her intellectually, while helping her develop confidence in her abilities. Despite societal prejudices, David Chun represented the challenges facing Chinese immigrant families in the American West. His parents had died during an influenza epidemic that particularly devastated Millfield's small Chinatown, and language barriers had complicated efforts to place him with Chinese families in larger cities. Most white families were unwilling to adopt a Chinese child, leaving 8-year-old David in a cultural limbo that threatened his connection to his heritage. Catherine had recognized David's exceptional mathematical abilities early on, but she had also worked to ensure he maintained connections to his cultural background. She had learned basic Chinese phrases to communicate with him during his initial adjustment, and had sought out Chinese merchants in nearby towns who could help David maintain his linguistic and cultural identity. Finally, there was Lucy O'Connor, whose epileptic seizures had made her a 3-time returnee to St. Agatha's after failed adoptive placements. Each family had returned her when her medical needs proved more challenging than they had anticipated, leaving 7-year-old Lucy with a devastating sense of being unwanted and defective. Catherine had approached Lucy's situation with the medical knowledge she had gained from helping the convent's infirmary, learning to manage Lucy's seizures while ensuring the child never felt ashamed of her condition. She had worked with Lucy to develop coping strategies and had educated the other children about epilepsy, creating an environment where Lucy felt supported rather than stigmatized. These 8 children had become Catherine's true calling during her years at St. Agatha's. Each one had taught her something different about resilience, about the power of unconditional love, and about the damage that institutional indifference could inflict on vulnerable souls. Now, as she lay in the cramped boarding house room listening to their sleeping sounds, Catherine understood that her decision to leave the convent wasn't really about choosing between religious life and secular motherhood. It was about choosing between following rules and following love, between serving an institution and serving the people that institution was supposed to protect. The morning sun streaming through Mrs. Fletcher's thin curtains illuminated a scene that would have horrified Mother Superior but filled Catherine with peaceful determination. Tommy was already awake, quietly helping David and Lucy with their morning routines. Emma was humming softly while she braided Sarah's hair. Ethan was examining the room's single window, probably planning some improvement to their living situation. Rebecca sat in the corner with her ever-present notebook, writing what Catherine suspected were detailed observations about their new circumstances. These were not damaged children requiring institutional management. They were a family unconventional, challenging, but bound together by love and mutual support that had sustained them through their worst difficulties. Catherine rose quietly and began planning their first full day of freedom. She had $300 from her parents' inheritance, 8 children who needed food, clothing, education, and medical care, and absolutely no idea how she was going to make any of it work long term. But for the first time in 10 years, she was exactly where she belonged. The reality of their situation hit Catherine like a physical blow on their 3rd morning at Fletcher's boarding house. Mrs. Fletcher knocked gently on their door just after sunrise, her usual kind expression replaced by uncomfortable concern. "Miss Walsh, I need to speak with you privately," the older woman said, glancing meaningfully at the 8 children who were beginning to stir from their makeshift sleeping arrangements. Catherine stepped into the narrow hallway, closing the door behind her. Mrs. Fletcher wrung her hands nervously, clearly struggling with what she needed to say. "I've had visitors," Mrs. Fletcher began quietly. "Town council members, church ladies, even Sheriff Morrison. They're concerned about the situation here." "What kind of concerns?" Catherine asked, though she suspected she already knew. They say it's not proper for an unmarried woman to be caring for 8 children, especially with some of them being boys approaching adolescence. They're questioning whether you have the legal right to keep them, whether you can provide adequate supervision, whether— Mrs. Fletcher paused, clearly uncomfortable with the next part. Whether the presence of the Chinese boy and the mixed-race child might cause problems in town. Catherine felt her stomach clench. She had known this was coming, but hearing it stated so bluntly made the threat feel immediate and overwhelming. What are they asking you to do? Mrs. Fletcher looked genuinely pained. They want me to evict you. They're saying that having so many children here is disruptive to my other boarders, that it's not appropriate for a respectable establishment. She paused, then added more quietly, they're also threatening to make trouble for my business license if I continue to house you. Catherine closed her eyes, feeling the weight of impossible choices settling on her shoulders. How long do we have? End of the week, Mrs. Fletcher said softly. I'm sorry, dear. If it were up to me alone, you could stay as long as needed. But I can't lose my livelihood. This boarding house is all I have. When Catherine returned to their room, 8 pairs of eyes were watching her with the careful attention of children, who had learned to read adult faces for signs of impending disaster. Tommy stepped forward first, his 12-year-old shoulders already set with the burden of responsibility he carried for the younger ones. We have to leave, don't we? He said simply. Catherine knelt down so she could meet their eyes at their level. Yes, we need to find somewhere else to live. Where? Asked Rebecca, her notebook already open to record whatever plan Catherine might have. The honest answer was that Catherine had no idea. Her $300 wouldn't last long feeding 9 people, and she was discovering that unmarried women with children faced barriers she had never imagined during her sheltered convent years. Landlords were reluctant to rent to her, employers were skeptical of hiring someone with 8 dependents, and the social prejudices against several of the children made finding housing in established communities nearly impossible. I don't know yet, Catherine admitted, but we'll figure it out together. That afternoon, Catherine walked through Millfield's dusty Main Street, stopping at every business, every boarding house, every potential source of employment or housing she could find. The responses were uniformly discouraging. Store owners were polite but firm of not needing help. The hotel owner took one look at her mention of 8 children and shook his head before she could finish explaining. The other boarding house in town wouldn't even let her through the front door once she mentioned her circumstances. At the town's small bank, Catherine met with President Harrison Whitmore, a stern man in his 50s who listened to her request for a small loan with barely concealed disapproval. Miss Walsh, you must understand that banking is a business of calculated risks, Whitmore said, leaning back in his leather chair. A single woman with no collateral, no steady income, and 8 children to support represents the opposite of a sound investment. I have my inheritance, Catherine protested. $300. Surely that demonstrates some financial stability. Whitmore's expression suggested he found the amount almost insulting. $300 might support 1 person for several months, but 9 people? You'll be destitute within 6 weeks. And then what? The children will become the town's responsibility, and frankly, Miss Walsh, Millfield is not equipped to handle that burden. The banker's words stung because they contained an uncomfortable element of truth. Catherine was operating on faith and determination, but she had no practical plan for long-term survival. Her convent years had provided her with skills in teaching, basic nursing, and household management, but none of those translated easily into income-generating employment for someone in her unusual circumstances. That evening, Catherine sat with the children around their small table, sharing a dinner of bread, beans, and the last of their preserved vegetables. The younger ones chattered about their day. David had helped Mrs. Fletcher with mathematical calculations for her business records. Emma had entertained other boarders with piano playing. Sarah had drawn pictures of birds she'd observed from their window, but Catherine could see the worry in the older children's faces. Tommy, Rebecca, and Jacob understood their precarious situation better than the younger ones, and they were clearly trying to think of solutions. "Miss Catherine," Jacob said carefully, "what if we split up? Just temporarily, until you can get established somewhere? Maybe some of us could find work, contribute to expenses." The suggestion was practical and heartbreaking in equal measure. Catherine could see the sacrifice Jacob was prepared to make, offering to give up the family they had created together if it would help the others survive. "No," Catherine said firmly, "we stay together. That's not negotiable. But what if we can't find anywhere to go?" Emma asked quietly, voicing the fear they were all carrying. Catherine looked around the table at these 8 remarkable children, who had already survived so much loss and uncertainty. "Then we create our own somewhere," she said, the words emerging from some deep place of certainty she didn't know she possessed. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Catherine was helping the children with their morning lessons. She had insisted on continuing their education despite their uncertain circumstances when Mrs. Fletcher knocked to announce that someone wanted to speak with her. In the boarding house parlor sat a woman Catherine didn't recognize, though her expensive clothing and confident bearing suggested she was someone of importance in the community. She was perhaps 40 years old, with graying brown hair and intelligent eyes that studied Catherine with careful assessment. "Miss Walsh, I'm Margaret Sinclair," the woman said, rising to shake Catherine's hand. "I understand you're facing some difficulties with housing arrangements." Catherine nodded cautiously, unsure whether this was another person coming to criticize her situation or someone offering help. "I represent a group of women in the territory who have been following your situation with interest," Mrs. Sinclair continued. "We believe you've shown remarkable courage in caring for these children, and we'd like to help." "What kind of help?" Catherine asked. Mrs. Sinclair smiled, the first genuinely warm expression Catherine had encountered from a stranger in days. "We've identified several possibilities for relocation. Places where you and the children might find more accepting communities." She opened a leather portfolio and spread out several maps and documents on Mrs. Fletcher's small parlor table. "There's a mining town called Cedar Ridge, about 80 miles north of here. The population is more diverse, with Chinese, Mexican, and Irish immigrant families, so your children might face less prejudice. There's also Riverside Valley, a farming community that's actively seeking teachers and medical assistants." Catherine studied the maps, feeling a mixture of hope and trepidation. Both locations were remote, which might provide the acceptance they needed, but would also mean complete isolation from any support systems. "The third option," Mrs. Sinclair continued, "is more challenging but potentially more rewarding. There's a large ranch in the Bitterroot Valley, about 100 miles west of here. The owner has been looking for someone to establish a school for the ranch workers' children. The position would provide housing, a steady income, and relative independence." "What's the challenging part?" Catherine asked. Mrs. Sinclair's expression became more serious. "The ranch owner is unconventional. He's an educated man, Harvard-trained, but he's also known for being difficult to work with. He's gone through several teachers and housekeepers. More importantly, he's openly dismissive of religion and traditional social conventions. Some people in the territory consider him quite scandalous." Catherine absorbed this information, weighing the risks and benefits. A ranch school position would solve their immediate problems of housing and income, but working for someone dismissive of religion after her recent departure from the convent presented obvious complications. "Why would he be willing to hire someone in my circumstances?" Catherine asked. "Because he cares more about competence than social respectability," Mrs. Sinclair replied. "And because his isolation makes it difficult to find qualified candidates willing to live so far from established communities." That evening, Catherine presented the 3 options to the children, explaining the advantages and challenges of each. choice. The discussion that followed revealed the remarkable maturity these 8 young people had developed through their shared experiences of loss and uncertainty. Tommy immediately grasped the strategic implications. The ranch school sounds like our best chance for stability, but what if this man decides he doesn't like us? We'd be stuck in the middle of nowhere with no alternatives. Rebecca had been taking notes throughout Catherine's explanation. What do we know about this ranch owner? What kind of education does he provide for workers' children? What are the living conditions? Even little Sarah contributed to the conversation, showing Catherine a drawing she had made while listening. The picture showed 9 figures standing together in front of a large building, with mountains in the background and children playing. In a schoolyard. The decision, when it came, felt inevitable. Cedar Ridge and Riverside Valley represented safety and conventional acceptance, but they also represented continued limitations and the possibility of facing the same prejudices. They were fleeing in Millfield. The ranch school represented risk and uncertainty, but it also represented the possibility of genuine independence and the chance to create something entirely new. We go to the ranch, Catherine announced after polling each child individually. We take the risk because it's the only option that gives us the chance to build the kind of life we want, instead of accepting what other people think we deserve. Mrs. Sinclair provided them with detailed directions to the Bitterroot Valley Ranch, along with a letter of introduction to its owner. She also arranged for transportation, a freight wagon heading in that direction that could carry their few possessions and provide safe passage through territory that could be dangerous for travelers. Their last night at Fletcher's boarding house was bittersweet. Mrs. Fletcher provided them with a farewell dinner and packed supplies for their journey, clearly moved by their departure despite the circumstances that had forced it. "You're either the bravest woman I've ever met or the most foolish," Mrs. Fletcher said, echoing her words from their first meeting. "But those children are lucky to have someone willing to take such risks for their sake." As Catherine tucked the younger children into their makeshift beds for the final time, she reflected on how dramatically their lives had changed in just 2 weeks. They had gone from the structured certainty of convent life to complete uncertainty about their future, but they had done it together, as a family united by choice rather than obligation. Tomorrow they would begin the journey to an unknown place, to work for a man whose character was questionable, in circumstances that offered no guarantees of success. But for the first time since leaving St. Agatha's, Catherine felt genuinely hopeful about their prospects. They were no longer running from something. They were traveling toward the possibility of building exactly the kind of life they wanted to live. The freight wagon lurched to a stop at the end of a long dirt road, and Catherine got her first glimpse of what would either be their salvation or their doom. The Bitterroot Valley stretched before them like something from a dream, endless grasslands dotted with cattle, framed by snow-capped mountains that seemed to touch the sky itself. But it was the ranch buildings that captured her attention and filled her with both hope and apprehension. The main house was unlike anything she had expected. Instead of a rough frontier cabin, she saw a 2-story structure built from local stone and timber, with large windows that spoke of someone who valued light and openness. Surrounding it were numerous outbuildings, barns, workshops, bunkhouses, all constructed with the same attention to quality and durability. This was clearly the home of someone with both money and refined taste. "Well, I'll be damned," muttered the freight wagon driver, a grizzled man named Pete, who had barely spoken during their 3-day journey. "Old Nathaniel's actually got himself a proper teacher this time. Hope you last longer than the others, ma'am." Before Catherine could ask what he meant by that ominous comment, a man emerged from the main house and began walking toward them. Catherine's first impression was of someone who moved with the confident stride of a person accustomed to command. But as he drew closer, she began to notice details that surprised her. Nathaniel Cross was younger than she had expected, perhaps in his early 30s, with dark hair that looked like it had been cut by someone more interested in function than fashion. He wore work clothes that were practical rather than fancy, but they were well made and fit him with the precision of someone who paid attention to details. His face was weathered by sun and wind, but his eyes held the sharp intelligence that Mrs. Sinclair had mentioned. What struck Catherine most forcefully was his expression as he took in the sight of her, and the 8 children climbing down from the wagon. There was no surprise, no judgment, no immediate dismissal, just careful assessment, as if he were evaluating a piece of equipment he was considering purchasing. "Miss Walsh, I presume," he said, his voice carrying the cultured accent of someone with Eastern education. "I'm Nathaniel Cross. Mrs. Sinclair's letter indicated you had some children with you, but I confess I wasn't expecting quite so many." Catherine felt the familiar defensive tension that had become second nature during their weeks of rejection and criticism. "Mr. Cross, if the number of children presents a problem, we can make other arrangements. Did I say it was a problem?" Cross interrupted, but his tone was curious rather than harsh. "I'm simply observing that you've brought me more potential students than I anticipated. That's actually encouraging. It suggests you take your educational responsibilities seriously." The children had remained close to Catherine during this initial exchange, but she could see them taking in details of their new surroundings with the careful attention of young people who had learned to assess new situations quickly. Tommy was studying the ranch buildings, clearly evaluating their defensive capabilities and potential escape routes. Rebecca was watching Nathaniel Cross with the analytical gaze of someone trying to solve a puzzle. Even little Sarah was peeking out from behind Emma's skirt, her artistic eye capturing details that others might miss. "Let me show you to your quarters," Cross said, gesturing toward a substantial building about 50 yards from the main house. "We can discuss your specific responsibilities once you've had time to settle in." The building he led them to was a revelation. Catherine had expected primitive accommodations, but instead found herself looking at what could only be described as a small but well-appointed house. The main room was large enough to serve as both living area and classroom, with built-in shelves for books, a stone fireplace for warmth, and windows that provided excellent natural light. A hallway led to 3 bedrooms, modest but comfortable, with real beds and furniture that looked like it had been built by someone who understood the difference between functional and beautiful. "This is where you'll live and conduct classes," Cross explained, opening shutters to let in more light. "The kitchen is fully equipped, and there's a root cellar for food storage. The well is about 20 yards to the east, and the privy is behind those trees." Catherine walked through the rooms in amazement. After weeks of cramped boarding house accommodations and uncertainty about their future, finding herself in a space that was actually designed for their needs felt almost too good to be true. "Mr. Cross, this is wonderful," she said, her voice thick with unexpected emotion. "But I have to ask, why are you doing this? Mrs. Sinclair mentioned that you've had difficulties with previous teachers. Why take a chance on someone in my circumstances?" Cross was quiet for a moment, studying her with those sharp eyes. "Miss Walsh, I'm going to be blunt with you because I believe in honest communication. I don't care about your previous life, your reasons for leaving the convent, or the social conventions you may have violated. What I care about is whether you can provide quality education for the children on this ranch, both yours and the workers' children who will be joining them." He paused, then continued in a tone that was matter-of-fact rather than cruel. "Previous teachers failed because they couldn't adapt to life here. They expected to impose Eastern educational methods on Western children, or they couldn't handle the isolation, or they were horrified by my lack of religious orthodoxy. If any of those things are going to be problems for you, it's better we discover that now rather than later." Catherine absorbed this information, recognizing both the opportunity and the challenge it represented. "What exactly are your expectations?" "For the educational program. Practical knowledge combined with intellectual development," Cross replied immediately. These children need to read, write, and calculate, but they also need to understand science, history, and critical thinking. I want them prepared for whatever futures they choose, whether that's ranch work, business, or further education in larger cities. Rebecca, who had been listening intently, stepped forward with her characteristic directness. Mr. Cross, what? Did you mean about religious orthodoxy? Are you saying we can't practice our faith here? Cross looked at the 11-year-old with obvious respect for her question. I'm saying that I don't share traditional religious beliefs, and I won't pretend to for the sake of social convention. But I have no interest in interfering with anyone else's faith practices. What you believe and how you worship is your business, as long as it doesn't interfere with educational goals or create problems among the other children. This was the moment Catherine had been dreading since Mrs. Sinclair first mentioned Cross's unconventional views. Her own relationship with faith had become complicated since leaving the convent, but she wasn't prepared to abandon it entirely. More importantly, she needed to understand how Cross's atheism would affect the children's development and education. What about moral instruction? She asked carefully. Character development, ethical guidance, those things that most people consider religious responsibilities. Cross smiled for the first time since their arrival, and Catherine was surprised by how the expression transformed his entire face. Miss Walsh, do you believe that atheists are incapable of ethical behavior? That moral character requires religious instruction? The question caught Catherine off guard, forcing her to examine assumptions she hadn't realized she held. No, I suppose not. But how do you teach children right from wrong without reference to divine authority? By helping them understand that ethical behavior serves practical purposes, Cross replied. Honesty builds trust, which makes cooperation possible. Compassion reduces suffering, which strengthens communities. Responsibility ensures that necessary work gets done. These principles don't require supernatural justification. They're simply intelligent ways to live. Tommy had been following this conversation with obvious fascination. So you think people should be good because it works better than being bad, not because God commands it? Exactly, Cross said, clearly pleased by Tommy's quick understanding. And I think that kind of ethical foundation is actually stronger than one based on fear of punishment or hope of reward. Catherine felt herself entering intellectual territory she had never explored during her convent years. The idea that morality could exist independently of religious authority was both fascinating and slightly frightening. But she could see that Cross was not a wild-eyed radical trying to corrupt children. He was a thoughtful person who had developed a coherent worldview, based on reason rather than faith. Mr. Cross, she said slowly, I think we need to discuss the specific curriculum you have in mind. I want to understand exactly what you expect from both me and the children. Excellent idea, Cross replied. But first, let's get you settled and meet the other children who will be joining your classes. Over the next hour, Catherine and her 8 children were introduced to the ranch's community. She met Maria Santos, the head cook, whose 3 children would be among Catherine's students. There was Henrik Larson, the foreman, whose twin daughters needed advanced mathematics instruction. James Running Bear, one of the ranch hands, had a son who was gifted in languages but struggled with written English. What struck Catherine most forcefully was the diversity of the ranch community. Unlike the homogeneous population of Millfield, Cross's ranch employed people from multiple ethnic backgrounds, creating an environment where her own unusual family didn't stand out as dramatically. But the real test came that first evening, when Cross invited Catherine to join him for dinner to discuss the educational program in detail. The children were settled in their new quarters, exploring their rooms and helping prepare their first meal in the ranch kitchen. Cross's main house reflected his personality, filled with books, scientific instruments, and artwork that suggested someone with sophisticated tastes and diverse interests. But it was also clearly the home of someone who lived alone, with a masculine practicality that spoke of efficiency over comfort. "Miss Walsh, I want to be clear about something," Cross said as they sat down to a meal that was simple but expertly prepared. "This arrangement will succeed or fail based on our ability to work together despite our different backgrounds and beliefs. I need a teacher who can think independently and adapt to changing circumstances. Can you be that person?" Catherine looked across the table at this man who was offering her family a chance at stability and independence, but who also represented everything her previous life had taught her to distrust. His atheism should have appalled her. His unconventional lifestyle should have scandalized her. His blunt manner should have intimidated her. Instead, she found herself intrigued by his intelligence, impressed by his practical approach to complex problems, and grateful for his willingness to judge her by her abilities rather than her circumstances. "Mr. Cross, I think we should try a trial period," she said finally. "1 month for you to evaluate my teaching abilities, and for me to determine whether I can work effectively in this environment. If either of us is unsatisfied at the end of that time, we part ways with no hard feelings." Cross extended his hand across the table. "1 month it is, Miss Walsh. I think this arrangement might surprise both of us." As Catherine shook his hand, she realized she was embarking on more than just a new job. She was beginning a partnership that would challenge everything she thought she knew about faith, morality, and the possibilities for creating meaningful community in an unforgiving world. 3 weeks into their trial period at Cross Ranch, Catherine was beginning to believe they had found their permanent home. The school was thriving beyond her wildest expectations, with 15 children ranging in age from 6 to 14 attending classes in the converted building that had become a true center of learning. But their peaceful progress was about to be shattered by forces beyond the ranch's boundaries. The trouble began on a Tuesday morning when Catherine noticed unfamiliar riders approaching the ranch from the east. She was conducting an outdoor science lesson, teaching the children about plant identification and ecological relationships, when Tommy pointed toward the dust clouds rising from the main road. "Miss Catherine, those aren't ranch hands," he said quietly, his protective instincts immediately alert to potential danger. Catherine shaded her eyes against the morning sun, studying the approaching group. 5 men on horseback, wearing the formal attire of town officials rather than the practical clothing of working ranchers. Their purposeful approach and official bearing suggested this was not a social visit. "Children, please gather your materials and return to the schoolhouse," Catherine instructed, keeping her voice calm despite the anxiety building in her chest. "Continue working on your mathematics exercises until I return." She watched as the older children, Tommy, Rebecca, Jacob, and Emma, immediately understood the potential seriousness of the situation and began herding the younger ones inside. These 8 had developed finely tuned instincts for recognizing when adult conversations might determine their fate. Nathaniel Cross had emerged from the main house and was walking toward the approaching riders with the same confident stride Catherine had noticed during their first meeting. But she could see tension in his shoulders that suggested he, too, recognized this visit as potentially threatening. The leader of the group was a portly man in his 50s, wearing a badge that identified him as some kind of territorial official. His companions included 2 men Catherine recognized from their brief stay in Millfield, Sheriff Morrison and Banker Whitmore, along with 2 others she didn't know but whose clothing suggested they held positions of authority. "Mr. Cross," the badge-wearing man announced without dismounting. "I'm Territorial Inspector William Hayes. We're here to investigate reports of irregularities in your employment practices and living arrangements." Cross stopped about 10 feet away from the mounted officials, his posture relaxed but alert. "What kind of irregularities, Inspector Hayes?" Hayes consulted a document he pulled from his coat pocket. "We've received complaints that you're harboring a woman of questionable moral character who has unlawfully assumed custody of 8 minor children. We're also investigating reports that you're operating an unlicensed educational facility that may be exposing children to inappropriate influences. Catherine felt her blood turn to ice. The careful life they had built over the past 3 weeks was being threatened by the same social prejudices and legal complications they had fled from Millfield. But she was surprised to discover that her fear was mixed with anger at the injustice of being pursued by people who cared more about social conventions than children's welfare. "Inspector Hayes," Cross replied in a tone that was scrupulously polite but carried an undertone of steel. "Miss Walsh is employed as a teacher for the children of my ranch workers. Her custody arrangements were legally established before her arrival here. As for the educational facility, I'm not aware of any territorial requirement for licensing private instruction on private property." Sheriff Morrison spoke up from his position beside Hayes. "Now, Nathaniel, you know there's been talk about the kind of influences these children might be exposed to out here. Folks are concerned about a woman who abandoned her religious vows and a man who's known for his unconventional views about proper Christian values." Catherine stepped forward, her decision made in an instant. She would not allow these men to destroy her family's security without facing direct opposition. "Gentlemen," she said clearly, I'm Catherine Walsh. If you have questions about my circumstances or my fitness to care for these children, I'm prepared to answer them directly." Inspector Hayes studied her with obvious disapproval, taking in her practical clothing, sun-weathered complexion, and confident bearing, all markers of a woman who had moved far beyond the expected boundaries of feminine propriety. "Miss Walsh, our records indicate that you renounced sacred vows to assume custody of 8 orphaned children without proper legal documentation or financial resources. We have affidavits stating that you're unfit to provide adequate supervision and that your situation presents moral hazards to the children in your care." Catherine felt the familiar surge of protective fury that had driven her to leave the convent in the first place. "Inspector Hayes, what moral hazards are you referring to?" "The hazard of providing these children with education, medical care, and loving attention. The hazard of treating them as valuable individuals rather than institutional problems to be managed." Banker Whitmore leaned forward in his saddle, his expression smugly satisfied. "The hazard of exposing impressionable young minds to atheistic influences and unconventional living arrangements that violate basic Christian principles." Cross's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm curious about your legal authority to evaluate the religious instruction provided to children on my private property. Are you operating under some territorial mandate I'm not aware of?" Hayes consulted his documents again, clearly uncomfortable with Cross's direct challenge to their authority. "We're conducting this investigation under the general welfare provisions of territorial law, which authorize officials to ensure the proper care and moral instruction of minor children." "And who," Cross continued relentlessly, "filed the complaints that initiated this investigation?" The pause that followed was revealing. Catherine could see Hayes exchanging glances with his companions, clearly reluctant to identify their accusers. Finally, Sheriff Morrison answered with obvious reluctance. "The complaints came from concerned citizens in Millfield, including representatives of St. Agatha's Convent." Catherine felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Mother Superior Agnes had not been content to simply exile her troublesome former nun. She was actively pursuing Catherine to ensure that her challenge to convent authority could not succeed and inspire other women to similar defiance. "I see," Cross said quietly. "So we're dealing with a coordinated effort to punish Miss Walsh for choosing her children's welfare over institutional loyalty." Inspector Hayes's face flushed with anger at Cross's accurate assessment. "Mr. Cross, your reputation for disrespecting proper authority is well known throughout the territory. This investigation will determine whether your influence presents dangers to the moral development of the children under Miss Walsh's care. Then by all means, conduct your investigation," Cross replied with dangerous calm. You'll find that the children here receive excellent education, proper medical care, adequate nutrition, and moral instruction based on ethical principles rather than fear and superstition. If those standards don't meet your approval, I'd be interested to hear your specific objections. What followed was the most thorough and hostile inspection Catherine had ever experienced. The officials examined every aspect of their living arrangements, questioned the children individually about their treatment and education, and scrutinized their curriculum materials for evidence of inappropriate content. Catherine watched with growing pride as her 8 children demonstrated the confidence and integrity they had developed over their weeks at the ranch. Tommy answered questions about their living situation with clear explanations of how their family operated democratically. Rebecca produced detailed records of their educational progress that impressed even the skeptical inspectors. Emma and Ethan described their music and mechanical projects with enthusiasm that was impossible to dismiss as coerced compliance. But it was little Sarah who provided the most powerful testimony. When Inspector Hayes asked her about her experiences at the ranch, Sarah surprised everyone by speaking for the first time since the house fire that had claimed her family. "This is my home," she said in a clear, soft voice that carried absolute conviction. "Miss Catherine loves us, and Mr. Cross teaches us important things. We're safe here." The officials were clearly taken aback by Sarah's unexpected eloquence, but they continued their investigation with systematic thoroughness. They examined the ranch's financial records, interviewed ranch workers about the children's behavior and treatment, and even inspected the schoolhouse curriculum materials for evidence of atheistic indoctrination. Cross accompanied the inspection with cooperative courtesy that never quite concealed his contempt for the entire process. When Inspector Hayes questioned the inclusion of scientific materials that contradicted biblical creation accounts, Cross responded with lectures on the importance of critical thinking and evidence-based reasoning that left the officials clearly out of their intellectual depth. The investigation concluded with a private conference among the officials while Catherine, Cross, and the children waited anxiously for their verdict. Catherine could see through the schoolhouse windows as Hayes and his companions engaged in heated discussion, gesturing toward the building where her family's future was being decided. When the officials finally returned, Inspector Hayes wore the expression of someone delivering news he found personally distasteful. "Miss Walsh, while we have concerns about the unconventional nature of your living arrangements, we have found no evidence of child neglect, abuse, or inadequate care. The children appear to be thriving academically, physically, and emotionally." Catherine felt relief flood through her, but Hayes wasn't finished. "However, we are placing this household under official monitoring. Territorial authorities will conduct periodic inspections to ensure continued compliance with child welfare standards. Any changes in circumstances, including Miss Walsh's employment status or living arrangements, must be reported to Territorial offices within 30 days. Cross stepped forward, his voice carrying quiet menace. "Inspector Hayes, I want to be absolutely clear about something. Any future harassment of my employees or interference with the operation of my ranch will be met with legal action through territorial courts. I have contacts in the territorial legislature who will be very interested to learn about official persecution of law-abiding citizens based on religious prejudice." Hayes's face darkened with anger, but he clearly recognized that Cross was not making empty threats. The ranch owner's wealth and political connections provided protections that most people in their situation could never access. "This matter is not closed," Hayes warned as he remounted his horse. "We'll be watching this situation very carefully." As the officials rode away, leaving dust clouds and lingering tension in their wake, Catherine realized that their peaceful interlude was over. They had survived this investigation, but powerful forces were now actively working against them, waiting for any excuse to separate her from the children she loved. Cross stood beside her, watching the riders disappear toward the horizon. Miss Walsh, I need you to understand something. This investigation wasn't really about child welfare or educational standards. It was about power, the power of traditional institutions to punish anyone who challenges their authority. Catherine nodded, understanding that their trial period had become something much more significant. They were no longer just building a school or creating a family. They were waging a battle for the right to live according to their own values rather than society's expectations. What happens now? She asked. Cross turned to face her, his expression serious but determined. Now we prove that our way of doing things produces better results than theirs. We make this school so successful, these children so obviously thriving, that even our enemies can't argue with the evidence. That evening, as Catherine tucked the younger children into bed, she reflected on how much their situation had changed in a single day. They were no longer simply building a new life. They were defending it against forces that would never stop trying to destroy it. But for the first time since leaving St. Agatha's Convent, Catherine felt she was not fighting alone. The months following the territorial investigation transformed both Catherine and the ranch in ways neither she nor Cross had anticipated. What had begun as a simple employment arrangement, teacher for room, board, and salary, had evolved into something far more complex and meaningful. Catherine found herself not just educating children, but helping to shape the entire character of the ranch community. It started with small changes that accumulated into something revolutionary. Catherine's medical knowledge, learned during her convent years, proved invaluable when ranch hand Miguel Santos injured his leg in a riding accident. The nearest doctor was 2 days' ride away, but Catherine was able to set the bone, treat the wound, and prevent infection using techniques that impressed everyone, including Cross himself. "Where did you learn surgical procedures?" Cross asked one evening as they sat in his study, reviewing lesson plans for the expanded curriculum they were developing. After the official investigation, their working relationship had shifted from cautious cooperation to genuine intellectual partnership. "The convent infirmary," Catherine replied. Looking up from the anatomy textbook Cross had ordered from a Chicago medical supply company. Sister Margaret was trained as a nurse before taking her vows. "She taught me basic surgical techniques, wound care, and pharmaceutical preparation. I never imagined how useful those skills would become." Cross leaned back in his chair, studying Catherine with the same analytical attention he brought to all problems that interested him. "You've been managing medical care for the entire ranch community for weeks now. Maria Santos tells me you've treated everything from childhood fevers to Henrik Larsson's chronic back problems. The workers are starting to call you Doc Walsh." Catherine felt a flush of pride mixed with uncertainty. "I'm not trained as a physician, Nathaniel. I'm just applying what I learned from practical experience." The use of his first name had become natural over the past months, part of the gradual breakdown of formal barriers between them. Cross had started calling her Catherine rather than Miss Walsh after she successfully treated an outbreak of influenza that could have devastated the ranch community. "Catherine, half the doctors in the territory have less practical experience than you do," Cross said firmly. "And unlike most of them, you actually listen to your patients and treat underlying causes rather than just symptoms." This conversation led to Catherine establishing a formal medical practice that served not just the ranch, but neighboring communities throughout the Bitterroot Valley. Word spread quickly about the woman doctor who charged fair prices, made house calls regardless of weather, and treated patients with dignity regardless of their social status or ability to pay. But it was Catherine's educational innovations that truly began to attract attention from beyond the valley. The school she had created was unlike anything in the Montana Territory. Instead of the rote memorization and rigid discipline that characterized most frontier education, Catherine encouraged critical thinking, creative problem-solving, and collaborative learning that produced remarkable results. Tommy Henderson had emerged as a natural leader among the students, organizing study groups and helping younger children with difficult concepts. But under Catherine's guidance, his leadership skills had evolved beyond mere protection of the vulnerable to genuine mentorship that helped other children discover their own strengths. "Miss Catherine," Tommy said one afternoon as they worked together on plans for a student-organized science fair, "I've been thinking about what I want to do when I grow up." Catherine looked up from the charts they were creating to display student projects. At 14, Tommy was beginning to think seriously about his future in ways that would have been impossible during their uncertain early months. "What conclusions have you reached?" she asked. "I want to be a teacher," Tommy said with quiet conviction. "Like you. I want to help kids who don't fit in other places find ways to succeed." The simple statement hit Catherine with unexpected emotional force. Tommy's transformation from angry, defensive child to confident young man who wanted to dedicate his life to helping others represented everything she had hoped to achieve through their unconventional family structure. Rebecca Thompson had blossomed into the school's most gifted academic student, but more importantly, she had developed the self-confidence to pursue her intellectual interests without apology. Her clubfoot, which had made her unmarriageable in conventional society, had become irrelevant in an environment that valued mind over physical appearance. "I've been corresponding with professors at several colleges," Rebecca announced during one of their evening family discussions. "Professor Williams at the University of Chicago believes I could qualify for their mathematics program if I continue my current studies." Cross, who had joined them for dinner as had become his habit, looked genuinely impressed. "Rebecca, that's remarkable. The University of Chicago has one of the most demanding mathematics programs in the country. Would they really accept a woman student?" Emma asked. The twins had both shown artistic talents that Catherine was helping them develop. But Emma was particularly interested in the changing opportunities for women in higher education. "Some colleges are beginning to admit women," Cross replied. "It's controversial, but the evidence for women's intellectual capabilities is becoming impossible to ignore." These conversations had become a regular feature of ranch life, with Cross often joining Catherine and the children for meals and educational discussions that ranged far beyond traditional curriculum boundaries. His presence had gradually shifted from formal employer visiting employees to something that felt increasingly like family dinners. Catherine had begun to notice other changes in Cross's behavior that suggested their partnership was affecting him as profoundly as it was affecting her and the children. The man who had initially presented himself as a confirmed bachelor, content with his isolated existence, was showing signs of genuine attachment to their expanding community. It was David Chun who first commented on Cross's transformation. Mathematical prodigy had been working with Cross on an engineering project, designing a more efficient irrigation system for the ranch, when he made an observation that surprised everyone. "Mr. Cross, you seem different than when we first arrived," David said with the directness that characterized all the children's interactions with adults at the ranch. "Different how?" Cross asked, looking up from the technical drawings they were reviewing. "Happier," David replied simply. "Like you're not lonely anymore." Cross had no immediate response to this observation, but Catherine noticed him becoming thoughtful in a way that suggested David's words had struck something significant. The growing sense of family extended beyond Catherine's original 8 children to include the ranch workers' children and, increasingly, Cross himself. Sarah Martinez had not only recovered her ability to speak but had emerged as the group's emotional center, offering comfort and support to other children with an intuitive understanding of their needs. "Sarah has a gift for healing that goes beyond medicine," Cross observed one evening after watching the 8-year-old help a newer student overcome homesickness. "She understands pain in ways that allow her to address it directly." Catherine nodded, recognizing the truth of his observation. Trauma can create either bitterness or compassion. Sarah chose compassion, but she needed a safe environment to make that choice possible. "Is that what happened to you as well?" Cross asked. Quietly, the question caught Catherine off guard, forcing her to examine her own emotional journey since leaving the convent. "I think so. Losing my parents and feeling abandoned by the church could have made me bitter. But caring for these children gave me a way to transform that pain into something useful." Their conversation was interrupted by Jacob Brown, who burst into the room with obvious excitement about something he wanted to share. "Miss Catherine, Mr. Cross, you need to see this," Jacob announced, holding up a letter that had arrived with the day's mail delivery. The letter was from the Territorial Education Department, responding to reports they had received about the innovative teaching methods being used at Cross Ranch. Instead of criticism, the letter contained a request for Catherine to present her educational approach at the Territorial Teachers Conference in Helena. "They want to study our methods," Jacob explained breathlessly. "They think other schools might benefit from learning how we do things here." Cross read the letter carefully, his expression showing both pride and concern. "Catherine, this is remarkable. Recognition, but it also means increased visibility. Are you prepared for that kind of attention?" Catherine considered the implications. Public recognition of their success would validate everything they had worked to build, but it would also attract the attention of their enemies and potentially expose them to new forms of criticism and interference. "I think we have to accept," she said finally. "If our methods can help children in other communities, we have an obligation to share what we've learned." The decision to participate in the Territorial Conference marked another turning point in their relationship. Cross insisted on accompanying Catherine to Helena, ostensibly to provide support and protection, but their travel arrangements required them to spend several days together away from the ranch for the first time. The journey to Helena revealed aspects of their partnership that had been developing gradually but had never been explicitly acknowledged. They worked together seamlessly, anticipating each other's needs and thoughts with the kind of understanding that usually developed only between people who had shared significant experiences over long periods. "Catherine," Cross said during their second evening on the road, as they sat around their campfire watching stars emerge in the vast Montana sky, "I need to tell you something." Catherine looked up from the presentation notes she was reviewing, struck by the serious tone in his voice. "When I hired you, I thought I was simply solving a practical problem, finding a qualified teacher for the ranch children. I never anticipated how profoundly your presence would change everything about life here." Catherine felt her heartbeat accelerate, sensing that Cross was approaching something significant that would alter their relationship permanently. "The ranch has become more than a business operation," Cross continued. "It's become a real community, a place where people thrive, rather than just survive. You've created something here that I didn't know was possible." "We've created it together," Catherine replied softly, understanding that their partnership had indeed evolved far beyond employer and employee. Cross met her eyes across the firelight, and Catherine saw there a vulnerability she had never glimpsed before. "Catherine, I want you to know that whatever happens in Helena, whatever challenges we face in the future, you and the children will always have a home at the ranch, not as employees, but as family." The word hung in the air between them, carrying implications that neither was quite ready to address directly. But as Catherine looked at this man who had offered her refuge when she had nowhere else to turn, who had defended her against official persecution, who had helped her create an environment where 8 unwanted children could flourish, she understood that their relationship had crossed boundaries neither had intended to cross. They were no longer just partners in an educational enterprise. They were no longer just friends united by shared values and common goals. They had become something more complex and precious, a family built by choice rather than blood, sustained by love that had grown gradually from respect and admiration into something deeper and more enduring. The Territorial Conference in Helena would test not just their educational methods, but the strength of the bonds they had created in their isolated valley sanctuary. The Territorial Teachers' Conference in Helena should have been Catherine's moment of triumph. Her presentation on individualized education for diverse student populations had been scheduled for the conference's main auditorium, with attendance expected from educators across the Montana Territory. But as Catherine and Cross approached Helena's outskirts on a crisp October morning, they could see smoke rising from multiple locations throughout the city, a sign that something was seriously wrong. "That's not chimney smoke," Cross observed grimly, urging their horses to a faster pace. "Those are building fires." They reached Helena to find the city in chaos. A smallpox outbreak had struck 3 weeks earlier, spreading rapidly through the overcrowded tenements where immigrant workers lived. The territorial government's response had been to quarantine entire neighborhoods, essentially abandoning the affected populations to die or recover without medical assistance. Dr. Samuel Morrison, the conference organizer and Helena's chief medical officer, met them at the hotel where they had planned to stay. His appearance was haggard, his usual professional composure replaced by barely controlled desperation. "Miss Walsh, Mr. Cross, I'm afraid the conference has been canceled," Dr. Morrison said without preamble. "We're facing a medical crisis beyond anything we've experienced in this territory. Half the city's doctors have fled rather than risk exposure, and we simply don't have the resources to contain the outbreak." Catherine absorbed this information while studying the scene around them. Helena's streets, usually bustling with commercial activity, were nearly deserted except for official vehicles and the occasional funeral wagon. The few people visible moved quickly and avoided contact with others, creating an atmosphere of fear. That reminded Catherine of her childhood memories of cholera outbreaks. "Dr. Morrison, what's the current casualty count?" she asked. "Over 200 dead, with at least 800 confirmed cases," Morrison replied. "The worst affected areas are the Chinese Quarter and the Irish tenements, places where people live in close quarters with poor sanitation." Cross stepped forward, his expression serious. "Doctor, what kind of assistance do you need?" Morrison looked at Cross with surprise, clearly not expecting an offer of help from visitors who could easily leave the affected area. "Frankly, Mr. Cross, we need everything. Medical supplies, qualified personnel, and most desperately, someone willing to organize care in the quarantine districts that our regular staff won't enter." Catherine felt the familiar surge of purpose that had driven every major decision in her life. "Dr. Morrison, I have medical training and experience treating infectious diseases. If you can provide me with supplies and access to the affected areas, I'm willing to help." "Catherine, absolutely not," Cross said immediately. "Smallpox exposure could kill you, and even if you survive, you could carry the infection back to the children." "Nathaniel, these people need help," Catherine replied firmly. "I can't walk away from suffering when I have skills that might save lives." Dr. Morrison studied Catherine with the careful attention of someone evaluating a potential resource. "Miss Walsh, I appreciate your offer, but smallpox care requires specific knowledge and techniques. What's your actual medical experience?" Catherine outlined her training at St. Agatha's Infirmary, her work treating ranch injuries and illnesses, and her successful management of the influenza outbreak that had threatened their community the previous winter. As she spoke, she could see Morrison's skepticism giving way to genuine interest. "You've successfully treated influenza, typhoid, and various surgical injuries," Morrison summarized. "That's more practical experience than half the doctors in this territory. But smallpox is different, more contagious, higher mortality rate, and requiring isolation protocols that most people can't psychologically handle." "Then teach me what I need to know," Catherine said simply. What followed was the most intensive medical education Catherine had ever received. Dr. Morrison spent the next 6 hours explaining smallpox pathology, treatment protocols, and isolation procedures that could prevent the disease's continued spread. Catherine absorbed information with the focused intensity of someone whose decisions would determine whether other people lived or died. Cross remained with them throughout this medical education, asking practical questions about supplies, logistics, and safety measures that revealed his determination to support Catherine's decision despite his obvious concerns for her welfare. If Catherine is going into the quarantine zones, she needs proper equipment and supplies, Cross told Morrison. What's required and how do we obtain it? Morrison provided them with a list of medical supplies, protective equipment, and basic necessities that the quarantine populations desperately needed. Cross immediately began arranging to purchase and transport these materials, using his wealth and business connections to obtain resources that the territorial government had been unable or unwilling to provide. The quarantine district was unlike anything Catherine had ever seen. Entire city blocks had been sealed off with wooden barriers and barbed wire, creating a virtual prison where hundreds of people struggled to survive without adequate food, clean water, or medical care. The smell of death and sickness hung over the area like a physical presence, and the few healthy people who remained moved through the streets like ghosts, avoiding contact with anyone who might be infected. Catherine's first patient was a Chinese woman named Li Wei, whose entire family had been stricken with the disease. Li Wei had recovered but was caring for her 3 children and elderly mother in a single room that lacked proper ventilation or sanitation. Li Wei asked in broken English, her eyes showing the desperate hope of someone who had received no assistance for weeks. Yes, Catherine replied simply, setting down her medical bag and beginning to examine the children. What Catherine discovered in that first household set the pattern for everything that followed. The smallpox outbreak was devastating, but the suffering was being magnified by abandonment, inadequate supplies, and the complete breakdown of basic social services. People were dying not just from the disease itself, but from dehydration, starvation, and secondary infections that could have been easily treated with proper care. Over the next 2 weeks, Catherine worked 18-hour days in conditions that tested every aspect of her medical knowledge and personal resilience. She treated patients ranging from infants to elderly adults, organized sanitation efforts that reduced disease transmission, and established supply distribution systems that ensured food and clean water reached the most vulnerable populations. Cross remained in Helena throughout this period, serving as Catherine's liaison with the outside world and ensuring she had everything needed to continue her work. Each evening, he would meet her at the quarantine boundary to deliver supplies and receive reports on her progress. Their conversations conducted across a barrier that prevented physical contact but couldn't diminish their emotional connection. Catherine, you've been working for 14 days straight, Cross said during one of these boundary meetings. Dr. Morrison tells me you've treated over 300 patients and reduced the mortality rate in your district by more than half. When do you plan to rest? Catherine looked exhausted but determined, her hair tied back practically and her clothing bearing the stains of constant medical work. When the crisis is over, Nathaniel. These people have been abandoned by everyone. Else I won't abandon them too. What about the children back at the ranch? They need you as well. Tommy is managing the school beautifully, and Maria Santos is providing excellent care. The children understand why I'm here, and they support this decision. Cross studied her, faced through the barrier that separated them, seeing in her expression the same fierce determination that had driven her to leave the convent and fight for her unconventional family. Catherine, I need to tell you something, Cross said quietly. Watching you work these past weeks, seeing the impact you're having on people who had been given up for dead, it's made me understand something about courage that I never recognized before. Catherine paused in organizing her medical supplies, sensing that Cross was building towards something significant. I've always thought of myself as someone who challenged social conventions, Cross continued. But what you're doing here, risking your life to care for people that society has written off, this is real courage. This is what it means to live according to principles rather than just talk about them. Nathaniel, what are you trying to say? Cross reached into his jacket and withdrew a small velvet box, holding it up so Catherine could see it through the barrier that separated them. I'm trying to say that I love you, Catherine Walsh. I love your courage, your compassion, your refusal to accept injustice when you have the power to fight it. When this crisis is over, when you're safely out of quarantine, I want to ask you to marry me. Catherine stared at the ring box, feeling emotions surge through her that had nothing to do with medical emergency or public health crisis. For weeks, she had been so focused on saving other people's lives that she had barely acknowledged her own need for love and partnership. Nathaniel, don't answer now, Cross interrupted gently. Just know that whatever happens, you have someone who sees exactly who you are and loves all of it. The conversation was interrupted by shouts from within the quarantine zone. Catherine turned to see people running toward her location, calling for the lady doctor to come quickly. Another medical emergency was developing, and her personal life would have to wait. But as Catherine hurried back into the quarantine zone to address the new crisis, she carried with her the knowledge that she was not just saving strangers' lives, she was building a future worth surviving for. The smallpox outbreak finally began to subside after 3 weeks of intensive intervention. Catherine's systematic approach to treatment, sanitation, and resource distribution had transformed a medical disaster into a manageable public health challenge. More importantly, her refusal to abandon the quarantined populations had inspired other volunteers to join the effort, creating a model of community response that would influence public health policy throughout the territory. Dr. Morrison conducted a formal review of the outbreak response, documenting Catherine's contributions for territorial medical records. His report praised her exceptional medical competence, innovative treatment protocols, and unprecedented success in reducing mortality rates under extreme conditions. Miss Walsh, Morrison said as Catherine prepared to leave Helena, your work here has saved hundreds of lives and demonstrated that smallpox outbreaks can be controlled through proper medical intervention and community support. The Territorial Medical Board wants to offer you a formal position as a public health officer. Catherine considered the offer briefly, recognizing the professional recognition it represented, but her answer came without hesitation. Thank you, Dr. Morrison, but my work is at the ranch. My family is there, and that's where I belong. As Catherine and Cross finally left Helena behind them, traveling back toward the Bitterroot Valley and the life they had built together, Catherine understood that the crisis had tested and proven everything she valued most. Her medical skills, her courage under pressure, her commitment to helping the most vulnerable all, had been validated under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. But more importantly, the crisis had revealed the depth of Cross's love and commitment to her, demonstrating that their partnership could survive any challenge they might face together. The ring box remained in Cross's jacket pocket, waiting for the right moment and the right answer. But both of them knew that the real question had already been answered in the quarantined streets of Helena, where love had been proven through action rather than words. The wedding ceremony took place on a crisp November morning, 6 months after Catherine's return from Helena. The entire ranch community gathered in the main meadow, along with guests who had traveled from across the territory, to witness the union of two people whose love story had become legendary throughout Montana. Catherine wore a dress that Emma and Maria Santos had spent weeks creating, elegant but practical, reflecting her transformation from sheltered convent nun to accomplished frontier woman. The fabric was a rich blue that complemented her eyes, and the design incorporated lace patterns that Sarah had drawn, making the dress a true collaboration between the women who had become her family. Cross stood, waiting beneath an arch of autumn branches that Tommy and Ethan had constructed, his usual practical clothing replaced by a formal suit that somehow managed to look both sophisticated and appropriate for outdoor ranch setting. But it was his expression that caught everyone's attention, the look of a man who had discovered something precious he had never expected to find. The ceremony itself was unlike anything the territory had seen before. Instead of a traditional minister, Dr. Morrison from Helena officiated, having been granted special authority to perform marriages by the territorial government. The vows Catherine and Cross exchanged were personal promises they had written themselves, speaking of partnership, shared purpose, and commitment to the unconventional family they were creating together. "I promise to stand beside you in building a life that serves others," Catherine said, her voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. "To honor your courage in challenging unjust conventions, and to share both the burdens and joys of creating something new in this world." Cross's response was equally personal. "I promise to support your calling to heal and teach, to protect the family we've chosen to create, and to prove every day that love based on mutual respect and shared values is stronger than any tradition or social expectation." But it was Tommy Henderson who provided the moment that would be remembered long after the ceremony ended. As Catherine and Cross exchanged rings, 14-year-old Tommy stepped forward with the quiet confidence that had marked his growth from angry orphan to natural leader. "Miss Catherine, Mr. Cross," Tommy said formally, "we 8 kids want to say something on behalf of everyone who's found a home here." Catherine felt tears begin to form as Tommy continued with words that he had clearly prepared carefully. "When Miss Catherine left the convent to take care of us, people said she was crazy. They said a woman alone couldn't raise 8 problem kids. But what they didn't understand was that Miss Catherine wasn't alone. She had us, and we had each other. And now she has Mr. Cross, and he has all of us, and we're not 8 problem kids anymore. We're a family that proves love is stronger than any rule someone else tries to make." The applause that followed Tommy's speech was thunderous, but Catherine barely heard it. She was looking at the faces of the 8 children who had transformed her life as completely as she had transformed theirs. Rebecca, now 15 and preparing for her first year at the University of Chicago. Emma and Ethan, whose artistic and mechanical talents were attracting attention from craftsmen across the territory. Jacob, whose natural leadership abilities had made him Tommy's partner in organizing student activities. David, whose mathematical brilliance had earned him correspondence with professors in Eastern universities. Lucy, whose epilepsy had become just another aspect of her identity rather than a defining limitation. And Sarah, whose recovery from trauma had been so complete that she was now helping other children overcome their own difficult experiences. The wedding celebration continued into the evening, with music provided by Emma's piano playing, and dancing that included everyone from the youngest children to the oldest ranch hands. But for Catherine, the most meaningful part of the day came during a quiet moment when she and Cross stepped away from the festivities to look out over the valley that had become their home. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Mrs. Sinclair hadn't told us about this place?" Catherine asked, her hand resting comfortably in Cross's. "I wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been brave enough to leave the convent." Cross replied, "This place was just a ranch before you and the children arrived. Now it's something much more important." Catherine nodded, understanding what he meant. The Cross Ranch had evolved into something unprecedented in the Montana Territory, an intentional community where people from diverse backgrounds worked together to create opportunities for those who had been rejected by conventional society. The school now served 26 children, ranging from the sons and daughters of ranch workers to children from neighboring communities, whose parents recognized the superior education being provided. The ranch's medical clinic treated patients from across the valley, with Catherine's reputation as a healer spreading beyond territorial boundaries. Most importantly, the ranch had become a proving ground for the idea that alternative families, based on choice rather than blood, could thrive in environments that supported individual growth and mutual cooperation, but their success was attracting attention that brought new challenges. 3 weeks after the wedding, Catherine and Cross received an unexpected visitor who would test everything they had built in ways they hadn't anticipated. The visitor was Sister Margaret O'Brien, the nun who had taught Catherine medical techniques. During her years at St. Agatha's Convent, Sister Margaret arrived unannounced on a cold December morning, her presence creating immediate tension among the children who remembered the institutional authority she represented. "Catherine, dear," Sister Margaret said as she was shown into the main house, "I've come to discuss a matter of utmost importance." Catherine felt her stomach clench with familiar anxiety. Despite her happiness and success, the appearance of anyone connected to her convent years still triggered fears about threats to her chosen family. "Sister Margaret, what brings you to the ranch?" Catherine asked, gesturing for the older woman to sit near the fireplace. Sister Margaret studied Catherine, with eyes that took in every detail of her transformation from religious novice to confident frontier woman. "My dear, you've become quite famous throughout the territory. Your work during the smallpox outbreak, your innovative educational methods, your success in caring for those 8 children. Everyone is talking about the former nun who built a new kind of family. Is that why you're here? To discuss my departure from religious life?" "Not exactly," Sister Margaret replied. "I'm here because Mother Superior Agnes is dying, and she's asked me to make you an offer." Catherine felt Cross's hand squeeze hers supportively. Neither of them had expected this development, and both understood its potential significance. "What kind of offer?" Catherine asked carefully. Sister Margaret leaned forward, her expression earnest. "Catherine, the church is changing. What you've accomplished here, the combination of practical service, educational innovation, and care for the marginalized represents exactly the kind of work the church needs to be doing in the modern world." She paused, then continued with obvious conviction. "Mother Superior Agnes wants to offer you the position of Mother Superior at a new kind of convent, one that would operate more like your ranch than like traditional religious institutions. You would have complete autonomy to develop programs that serve frontier communities, with church funding but without the restrictions that limited your work at St. Agatha's." Catherine stared at Sister Margaret, struggling to process the implications of what she was hearing. The church that had rejected her unconventional approach to caring for children was now offering to support exactly the kind of work she was already doing. "What about the children?" Catherine asked. "What about my marriage to Nathaniel?" "The children would be part of the new institution," Sister Margaret replied. "They would receive the same excellent education you're already providing, but with additional resources and support. As for your marriage..." She paused, clearly uncomfortable with this aspect of the offer. "The church recognizes that your union with Mr. Cross is based on shared commitment to serving others. While unconventional, it represents the kind of partnership that might be necessary for effective frontier ministry." Cross spoke for the first time since Sister Margaret's arrival. "Sister, are you saying the church is willing to recognize our marriage and support our work without requiring Catherine to return to traditional religious vows?" "I'm saying the church is willing to create a new category of religious service that acknowledges the realities of frontier life while maintaining commitment to Christian principles," Sister Margaret replied. "Catherine would be a Mother Superior, but one who operates more like a community leader than a traditional nun." The offer was extraordinary, representing recognition and support that could transform their work from local success to territorial influence. But Catherine found herself hesitating, not because the offer wasn't appealing, but because it required her to define her work in religious terms that might not accurately reflect her current beliefs and motivations. "Sister Margaret, I need to ask you something directly," Catherine said. "Why is the church making this offer now? What's changed?" Sister Margaret's expression grew more complex, showing both sadness and hope. "What's changed is that we've seen the results of your work. Your 8 children have become remarkable young people, who contribute positively to their community. Your educational methods produce better outcomes than traditional approaches. Your medical work saves lives that would otherwise be lost. The Church can no longer deny that your approach to service is more effective than conventional religious institutions. She paused, then added more quietly, and what's changed is that many of us within the Church have come to understand that rigid adherence to traditional rules sometimes prevents us from doing the work we're called to do. Over the following week, Catherine found herself pulled in directions she hadn't expected. The Church's offer represented validation of everything she had accomplished, but it also threatened to transform her work into something institutional that might lose the personal touch that made it effective. More challenging was a second development that arrived through the territorial mail system. The University of Chicago had extended an invitation for Catherine to join their faculty as the first woman professor in their new department of frontier medicine. The position would allow her to train other women in the medical techniques she had developed, potentially multiplying her impact across the entire western frontier. Cross found Catherine in their bedroom one evening, surrounded by letters and documents that represented the various opportunities and challenges they were facing. 3 different paths, Catherine said, without looking up from the papers. Stay here and continue building what we've started. Return to the Church with expanded authority and resources. Or move to Chicago and influence medical education on a national level. Cross sat beside her on the bed, studying the documents that could determine their future. What does your instinct tell you? My instinct tells me that all these opportunities exist because of what we've built here, Catherine replied. But accepting any of them might require us to leave behind the very thing that made our success possible, which is... Catherine looked around their bedroom, with its combination of practical furniture and personal touches that reflected their blended family. Through the window, she could see lights in the schoolhouse where Rebecca was tutoring younger students in mathematics and hear the sound of Emma playing piano in the main house. The freedom to make decisions based on what's best for the people we love, rather than what's expected by institutions or professional obligations, Catherine said simply. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Tommy's voice called from the hallway. Miss Catherine, Mr. Cross, we need to talk to you about something important. They found all 8 children gathered in the main house living room, their expressions serious in a way that reminded Catherine of the family meetings they had held during their most challenging times. We've been talking about the visitors and the letters, Rebecca said, serving as spokesperson for the group. We know you're considering different options for the future. We want you to know that whatever you decide, we support you, Emma added. But we also want to tell you what we think. Jacob stepped forward with the confidence that had marked his development from uncertain child to natural leader. Miss Catherine, you saved us by choosing us over the rules. Now other people want to give you rules again, even if they're better rules than before. What we think, Tommy said, taking over the explanation, is that you're most effective when you're free to do what seems right, not when you're following someone else's plan. David, now 11, and showing the analytical thinking that would serve him well in his future mathematical career, added his perspective. The church offer and the university offer are both trying to make you fit into their systems. But you work best when you create your own system. Even little Sarah, now 9 and fully recovered from her early trauma, contributed to the family discussion. This is our home, she said simply. We don't want to leave it, and we don't want it to change into something else. Lucy, whose epilepsy had become simply another aspect of her identity rather than a defining limitation, spoke with the wisdom of someone who had learned to value acceptance over external validation. Miss Catherine, you taught us that being different isn't bad, it's just different. Why would you want to become the same as other teachers or other nuns? Catherine looked around the room at these 8 remarkable young people who had grown from rejected orphans into confident individuals with clear values and strong voices. Their perspective on her decision-making process was both touching and illuminating. "So you think I should decline all these offers?" Catherine asked. "We think you should make the choice that lets you keep being yourself," Ethan replied. "The person who sees what needs to be done and does it, regardless of what other people think is proper." Cross had remained quiet during the children's presentation, but now he spoke with the calm certainty that had characterized his support throughout their relationship. "Catherine, I think they're right. These offers are recognition of your success, but accepting any of them might require you to duplicate that success within constraints that could make it impossible." The family meeting continued late into the evening, with each person contributing perspectives on the choices they faced as a family. What emerged from the discussion was a clear understanding that their strength came from their independence, their flexibility, and their commitment to serving individual needs rather than institutional expectations. Catherine's decision, when she announced it the next morning, surprised no one who knew her well, but shocked the territorial officials and religious authorities, who had expected her to accept the recognition and resources they were offering. She would decline all external offers and continue building the work they had started at Cross Ranch, but with expanded ambitions that reflected their growing influence and resources. The ranch would become a formal training center for frontier medicine and innovative education, attracting students and apprentices who could carry their methods to other communities. They would establish a network of similar institutions across the territory, each operating independently but sharing resources and expertise. Most importantly, they would prove that alternative institutions, based on love and practical service rather than traditional authority structures, could not only survive but thrive in ways that transformed entire communities. The decision to stay and expand rather than leave and integrate represented Catherine's final transformation from institutional follower to independent leader, from someone seeking approval to someone confident in her own judgment and values. 20 years had passed since Catherine Walsh first walked through the gates of Cross Ranch with 8 frightened children and a heart full of desperate hope. Now, as she stood on the porch of the main house watching the morning sun illuminate the Bitterroot Valley, she could see the remarkable transformation that love and determination had created. The valley was no longer just a ranch. It had become a thriving community of interconnected institutions that served as a model for the entire American West. The original schoolhouse had expanded into a complex of buildings that housed the Montana Territory's most prestigious private academy. Drawing students from as far away as California and New York, the medical clinic had evolved into a full hospital that pioneered frontier medical techniques now taught in universities across the country. But it was the sight of children playing in the schoolyard that filled Catherine with the deepest satisfaction. These weren't just the children of ranch workers anymore. They were the sons and daughters of senators, business leaders, and professionals who had chosen to send their children to an institution that valued character development over social status, practical skills over rote memorization, and individual potential over conformity to expectations. "Quite a view, isn't it?" Cross said, joining Catherine on the porch with 2 cups of coffee, a morning ritual they had shared for 2 decades. At 53, Nathaniel Cross had gained the silver hair and weathered features of a man who had spent his life building something meaningful, but his eyes still held the sharp intelligence and quiet humor that had first attracted Catherine to him. Their marriage had deepened over the years into a partnership so seamless that many visitors assumed they had been together their entire lives. "I was thinking about that first morning," Catherine replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "When Tommy was trying to cook breakfast for everyone, and I realized we were about to lose our family. And now Tommy is the headmaster of our academy, married to Rebecca, with 3 children of their own," Cross observed with obvious pride. Catherine smiled, remembering the wedding ceremony 5 years earlier when Tommy Henderson had married Rebecca Thompson in the same meadow where she and Cross had exchanged vows. The former angry orphan had become one of the territory's most respected educators, while Rebecca had completed her mathematics degree at the University of Chicago. Before returning to establish the Academy's advanced mathematics program, their love story had been almost as unlikely as Catherine and Cross's own relationship. The protective boy who had appointed himself guardian of the vulnerable children, and the brilliant girl whose clubfoot had made her unmarriageable in conventional society. But watching them work together to educate the next generation of frontier leaders, Catherine understood that some partnerships were destined to transform individual potential into something extraordinary. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the main road, where a familiar figure was riding toward the ranch with the confident posture of someone bringing good news. Emma Martinez Patterson dismounted gracefully and bounded up the porch steps with energy that belied her 30-year-old status as one of the territory's most successful artists. "Catherine, Nathaniel," Emma called out, her face glowing with excitement. "The news from Washington is official. Montana Territory will become a state next year, and they want our academy to serve as the model for the new state's public education system." Catherine felt a surge of pride mixed with trepidation. Official recognition of their educational methods represented the ultimate validation of everything they had worked to build, but it also meant increased scrutiny and potential pressure to conform to bureaucratic standards that might compromise their effectiveness. "Emma, that's wonderful news," Catherine said, embracing the young woman who had grown from a timid twin into a confident artist whose paintings were displayed in galleries from San Francisco to Boston. "But what exactly does serving as a model entail?" Emma settled into one of the porch chairs, her expression becoming more serious as she considered the implications. "According to Senator Williams, the federal government wants to document our curriculum, training methods, and administrative practices so they can be implemented in public schools throughout the new state." Cross leaned against the porch railing, his analytical mind immediately grasping the challenges this recognition would create. "Emma, did Senator Williams mention anything about federal oversight or requirements for standardization?" "He did," Emma admitted reluctantly. "They want to ensure that any public implementation of our methods meets federal educational standards and doesn't include elements that might be considered inappropriate for government-funded institutions." Catherine understood immediately what this meant. Their success had been built on the freedom to address individual student needs, to incorporate diverse cultural perspectives, and to challenge social conventions that limited children's potential. Federal involvement might require them to eliminate exactly the innovations that made their approach effective. "We need to call a community meeting," Catherine said finally. "This decision affects everyone here, not just the academy staff." The community meeting that evening filled the main hall of the expanded schoolhouse, with attendance that reflected the remarkable diversity of the Cross Ranch community. Former students who had become doctors, teachers, and business leaders sat alongside current students, ranch workers, and neighbors from throughout the valley. The 8 original children, now adults with families and careers of their own, occupied places of honor in the front row. Catherine stood before this gathering with the same mixture of nervousness and determination she had felt during her first day of teaching 20 years earlier. But now, instead of 8 frightened orphans, she was addressing a community of hundreds of people whose lives had been shaped by the principles she and Cross had fought to establish. "Friends," Catherine began, her voice carrying clearly through the crowded hall, "we've received recognition that validates everything we've worked to build here. The federal government wants to use our methods as the foundation for public education throughout Montana." A murmur of excitement rippled through the audience, but Catherine raised her hand for continued attention. "However, this recognition comes with requirements that might compromise the very qualities that made our work successful. We need to decide, as a community, whether we accept this opportunity or continue developing independently." What followed was one of the most thoughtful discussions Catherine had ever witnessed. Current students spoke about the importance of maintaining the individualized attention that had helped them thrive. Parents discussed their desire for broader access to quality education balanced against concerns about bureaucratic interference. Teachers and staff members shared their perspectives on the challenges of scaling their methods to larger, more diverse populations, but it was David Chun, now 31 and serving as the Academy's mathematics and science coordinator, who articulated the central issue most clearly. "The question isn't whether our methods are effective," David said, standing to address the entire assembly. 20 years of results prove they work better than conventional approaches. The question is whether we believe those methods can remain effective within institutional constraints designed for different purposes. Sarah Martinez, now a respected art therapist who had helped hundreds of children overcome trauma, added her perspective with the quiet authority that had marked her recovery from her own childhood difficulties. "When I first came here, I couldn't speak because the world had become too frightening to trust," Sarah said, her clear voice carrying to every corner of the hall. Catherine and Nathaniel created a place where it was safe to be damaged, safe to heal at my own pace, safe to become who I was meant to be. That safety came from knowing they could make decisions based on what I needed, not what regulations required. Lucy O'Connor Running Bear, whose epilepsy had become just another aspect of her identity as a successful rancher and mother, spoke with the practical wisdom of someone who had learned to navigate a world that didn't always accommodate differences. "I think we have an obligation to share what we've learned," Lucy said thoughtfully. "But we also have an obligation to preserve the thing that made sharing possible. Maybe the answer isn't choosing between recognition and independence, maybe it's finding a way to have both." Jacob Brown, now the territory's first elected official of mixed heritage and a powerful advocate for civil rights, stood to address the assembly with the natural leadership abilities that had emerged during his years at the ranch. "What if we propose a compromise?" Jacob suggested. "We allow federal officials to study our methods and document our practices, but we maintain complete autonomy over our own operations. We become a research and training center that influences public education without being controlled by it." Cross stepped forward to support Jacob's proposal with his characteristic blend of idealism and pragmatism. "Jacob's suggestion addresses our central concern," Cross said. "We can serve as a model and training center for public education while preserving the independence that makes our work effective. Federal officials can observe our methods, train with our staff, and adapt our approaches for their own institutions, but they cannot dictate how we operate our own programs." The discussion continued for hours, with community members exploring every aspect of the proposed compromise. What emerged was a clear consensus that their responsibility extended beyond their own community, to include sharing their innovations with others, but not at the cost of compromising their ability to serve individual needs effectively. Catherine's closing remarks to the assembly reflected the wisdom she had gained through 20 years of building something unprecedented in American education. 20 years ago, I left a religious institution because I believed love was more important than rules," Catherine said, her voice strong with conviction. "Tonight, we're making the same choice on a larger scale. We'll share what we've learned with anyone willing to listen, but we won't sacrifice what makes our work effective for the sake of official recognition or institutional approval." The vote was unanimous. Cross Ranch would serve as a model and training center for innovative education and frontier medicine, but it would maintain complete independence in its own operations. Over the following months, Catherine found herself hosting delegations of educators, government officials, and researchers who came to study the Cross Ranch method of education and community development. Many left frustrated by their inability to reduce the ranch's success to simple formulas or standardized procedures. But others left inspired by what they had witnessed and committed to adapting the ranch's principles to their own situations. Most meaningful validation came from the 8 original children, whose own lives and achievements demonstrated the long-term impact of the choices Catherine had made 2 decades earlier. Tommy and Rebecca's 3 children were growing up with the confidence of young people who had never doubted their worth or potential. Emma and Ethan had established successful businesses that employed dozens of people while pursuing their artistic and mechanical passions. Jacob had been elected to the territorial legislature, where he championed policies that protected the rights of minorities and marginalized populations. David was corresponding with universities across the country about collaborative research, projects that applied mathematical principles to solving practical problems. Lucy was raising 5 children while managing one of the most successful ranches in the territory. Sarah had established art therapy programs in schools throughout the West, helping countless children overcome trauma through creative expression. But perhaps the most powerful testament to their success was the letter that arrived from Mother Superior Anza's successor at St. Agatha's Convent, the new Mother Superior, Sister Catherine, who had taken Catherine's religious name in honor of her example, wrote to request permission to send young nuns to Cross Ranch for training in practical ministry that serves real human needs rather than institutional requirements. It seems, Cross observed as they read the letter together, that the church has finally caught up to your innovations. Catherine smiled, remembering the frightened young woman who had stood at the convent gates 20 years earlier with 8 children and no clear plan beyond love and determination. No, she replied thoughtfully. I think we've simply proven that there are many ways to serve God and serve people. The church is learning to recognize service wherever it occurs, regardless of whether it fits traditional categories. As the sun set over the Bitterroot Valley on a warm spring evening, Catherine and Cross sat on their porch watching their extended family gather for dinner. Children who had been students 20 years earlier were now bringing their own children to experience the education and community that had shaped their lives. The ranch had become not just a school or a medical center, but a living demonstration that love, properly applied, could transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. The girl who had been told she was too ugly to marry had become a woman whose beauty was measured in the lives she had touched. The innovations she had created and the love she had proven was stronger than any social convention or institutional rule. Catherine Walsh Cross had found not just acceptance, but the opportunity to prove that human worth was determined not by appearance or social status, but by the courage to love unconditionally and serve without reservation. In saving 8 unwanted children, she had discovered the person she was always meant to become, and in the process, she had changed the world around her in ways that would endure for generations to come. The legacy was not just the institutions they had built or the methods they had developed, but the proof that ordinary people, given freedom to follow their deepest convictions, could create extraordinary change that rippled outward to transform entire communities and territories. As stars began to appear in the vast Montana sky, Catherine understood that her journey from rejected daughter to respected leader represented something universal about human potential, the capacity for transformation that exists within everyone, waiting only for the right circumstances and the courage to act on love rather than fear. The story that had begun with abandonment and despair had become an epic of hope, proving that the most powerful force in the world was not wealth or status or conventional beauty, but the determination to see worth where others saw only problems, and to create love where others saw only obstacles. And in the laughter of children playing in the gathering dusk, in the conversations of students discussing ideas that would shape their futures, and in the quiet satisfaction of work that had made the world better than it was, Catherine could hear the echo of her father's long-ago words. Every person carries a spark of the divine. Some folks just need help finding the tinder to light it properly. She had spent her life providing that tinder, and the light it had created would burn long after she was gone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.